I, Moccasin, in consideration of 2 coats, 4 pair stockings, and 4 bottles of cider, do hereby grant all my land upon the Perkiomen to William Penn forever, and promise never to molest any Christians that shall seat thereon by his orders. Witness my hand the 3rd day of the 4th month, 1684. 10,000 years before our township would have an English name, there was home life by the branch. The Lenape, here the Turtle or Unami clan, did what all human families do: built dwellings, made clothing and boats, gathered food, and played with pets. But unlike those who would replace them, they lived with the earth without understanding what it would mean to buy and sell it as property. Their unspoiled forests on the Perkiomen belonged to the Schuylkill River watershed. With the white man's arrival, a growing fur trade brought Iroquois Indians along a path leading south from the Blue Mountain to the new port of Philadelphia. This Maxitoni Trail was the forerunner of the North Wales Road, later the Sumneytown Pike, finally Route 63. Lower Salford would be laid out where the trail crossed the Skippack and Branch Creeks amidst a cluster of German-speaking settlers 30 miles north of the city. The newcomers had been at home on farms in Switzerland and Germany. They were an orderly, frugal, devout sort, divided among 5 Protestant sects. Those from Germany had been living in large farmsteads called hofs. The connected backs of their houses and barns protected a home-like living space for man and beast. This patchwork of hofs and villages southeast of Heidelberg offered little parallel to the unsurveyed wildness of the Perkiomen watershed. The giant arms of a sycamore by the branch spread an unfamiliar canopy over the first lonely hearths. But Europeans had little trouble converting wilderness into real estate. The seal of William Penn's colony and the signatures of his land commissioners confirmed your right to buy and trade it for a profit. Or you could make it your family legacy. The steep pitch of a roofline by the Skippack shows where a German-speaking community gathered for an Ufblöcke, a log house raising that left a new sign of being at home in Lower Salford.
When we look at an old farmstead, which we're doing here, one of the originals, then we were thinking of the location of the garden and the original log house with its lilac bush usually marking the spot, and the fields surrounding.
Locating the features of pioneer living has been Bob Bucher's passion for 60 years.
We do have 2 lilac bushes here, one behind me and one in front, which mark something or other than the garden. We're not quite sure at this point. Should I probe a little bit here?
Wherever people have been at home, Bob can find telling evidence of their dwelling.
When you have a lilac bush that has a trunk at 3 to 4 inches thick, you know you have a good old one. That's usually what the old ones are. The lilac bush symbolized the family and its permanence. The lilac bush on a place meant that the family would belong there throughout the centuries.
Bob sees an old root cellar as an invitation to get past the overgrowth of 20th century forgetfulness, back into the atmosphere of a culture centered on producing and preserving food. Re-entering that life of the past takes the persistence of a strenuous quest. While it will draw you underground on the Andrew Lederach plantation, it may surprise you on the next farm with the substantial home of Andrew's Mennonite minister, Dealman Kolb, probably built in the 1740s. This might be Lower Salford's oldest house and one of its best preserved. The design is Flemish. The barn is gone here, but there's a fine one on another neighboring homestead, that of Peter Freed in the 1750s. Today the township's children know it as Heckler Plains, named for Peter Freed's son-in-law George Heckler, a penniless immigrant from Alsace. At the Price Farm, too, along the Indian Creek, an ancient cellar survives. It was there long before the township's earliest known painting was made here, in 1801, showing one of the oldest Dunkard homesteads in America. The first son on this farm had married a Lenape girl kept behind by illness when her relatives departed for the Susquehanna. Her remains are probably part of the soil in the family grave plot, the final stage of being at home in Lower Salford. The township can claim another forgotten spiritual first.
We're in the southwestern corner of Lower Salford at the site of the early Skippack Reformed Church settlement.
Joel Alderfer, ninth-generation native, went into the bowels of Philadelphia's archives to find an old road draft. It proves that there indeed was a meeting house here. Though torn down in the 1740s, it had been the first for its denomination in America.
The site of the church, as far as we know, is just over here in this the small wood lot.
Eastward, in another corner of Lower Salford, the heritage of the Schwenkfelders is kept by farmer Sam Kriebel. Living on the Kriebel homestead, he cares for the ancient grove of oaks and hickories around a meeting house built on his ancestral acreage.
I presume it was there at the time the Schwenkfelders arrived. There's a lot of white oak at that size are known to have been as old as 300 years.
The common coin of Sam's conversation are the family names of Schwenkfelder immigrants from Silesia in 1734.
Some Kriebels, some Yakels, Mechters, Hoffman, Heydrich.
In March 1726 came a petition. There are settled a great many families between Skippack and the northeast branch of Perkiomen. The petitioners think it is too great a circuit for one constable, and that it would be more convenient if there was a township laid out. Not from these 24 German subscribers, but from English land speculators came the name Salford. 15 years later, the corner next to Skippack was set apart as Lower Salford. By now there were 3 inns along the road to Philadelphia, a grist mill on the branch and another on the Skippack, set among 4 definite religious clusters, each of which would eventually produce a meeting house. The largest land area was owned by the Mennonites, with a meeting house and school near later Harleysville. Next in size was a Reformed corridor leading from the southern corner. 2 smaller groups had the northern corners. On the west, the Dunkers of Indian Creek, and on the east, the later arriving Schwenkfelders. 4 Lutheran homesteads were scattered among the rest. Thriving in the heart of the Mennonite community was a dual and long-term legacy of folk art. Above the Clemens Mill on the branch, a 19th century barn still yields seniority to the original house. Here miller John Clemens played his sitar, the earliest recorded use of what became a national hobby in the 1960s. Scholar Ralph Lee Smith brought his collection to the Clemens house to celebrate the Lower Salford roots of the Appalachian dulcimer. The Clemens children's school teacher was America's first known frock tourist, Christopher Dock. He wrote about using this art in his treatise on school management, America's first book on the topic, date-lined Salford, 1750. The simple colors of Dock's designs still bloom shyly today, the hidden flowering of an outwardly plain culture. Nowhere in the township is that old plain spirituality better felt than in the dreaming stillness of the empty Schwenkfelder meeting house by the Skippack, next to the Kriebel homestead. Here are memories of October 1777, when the surrounding grove was crowded with George Washington's army, camping amidst a community that largely rejected all war. On the banks of the nearby creek, thousands of militiamen were recouping from defeat at the Battle of Germantown. Scrounging for food on the surrounding farms, they cooked with burning fence rails. Along the road hugging the west bank of the creek, the Army captured a spy, some say a deserter, in a mill. In the latest building there, the Hatfield Packing Company had its start. A more famous spy story, the capture of Major Andre, would be remembered in a schoolchild's picture found in a Lower Salford home. But only a few history buffs today could identify the field by the Skippack where our very own spy hanging took place at an apple tree. General Washington, it was said, astride a white horse, shut off the scene from the curious gaze of local boys. No sounds of war disturbed the banks of the Skippack for the next 2 centuries. The strength of this land was quietly stated in the bulk of a barn built 18 years after the Peace of Paris. A few symbols of American identity appeared, but most buildings bore only a name and a date. While Henry and Ann Lederach built a new house, a back part of the homestead carried other markers. The family cemetery, even today, is remembered as including the graves of the township's last known Indians. While none of the stones bore an Indian name, on nearby Camp Wawa Road, Indians visited a huge oak for another century. Within the past decade, it was killed by road-widening bulldozers. Another mile down the branch is the beautiful barn of Mennonite minister Christian Halteman, who died in 1833. The even older house, where Robert Bucher lived in a later generation, is home today for the Dodd family. Until 150 years ago, the fire corner was the focus of the farmhouse. Here the food was cooked, wool and linen spun, and visitors entertained. And long after the family was in bed, here is where courting couples kept warm by the embers.
Denken dich war alles gut essen und alles, was du dir getan hast für uns. Groß Dank, unser Vater. Amen.
The hunger to taste time past takes many Lower Salfordians of all ages to the annual fall Heckler Fest at Heckler Plains. Lives on in the pen and brush of Lower Salford native Michael Kriebel. He recreates ever more faithfully the handmade rewards given by local schoolmasters to their pupils. These paper treasures are still turning up in old Bibles, often better preserved than the schoolhouses in which they were drawn. Some proctors served as bookplates. This songbook belongs to me, Anna Keeley, Lower Salford Township, 1821. Anna's neighbor, Mary Alderfer, had a singing or note booklet full of handwritten hymn tunes, also marked Lower Salford. Some of the tunes were put into print by local schoolmaster Samuel Musselman in 1844. More than a century later, a 90-year-old man still knew most of them by heart. Ryan Gottschall taught this hymnody to his grandnephew Clarence Kulp of Vernfield. Today, Clarence passes it on in a meeting house originally in Lower Salford, but torn down and rebuilt in Franconia Township. It's called the Herite House after a Lancaster County preacher. Every summer, the older scene is relived as here with the descendants of Lower Salford's evangelist Rose Jelly, Jake Moyer. Just across the fields is Klein's Meeting House, an outreach of the original Indian Creek Dunkard congregation.
This is the valley of the Indian Creek where the Dunkards, or German Baptist Brethren, settled in 1719 and 1720. Although our official name was German Baptist Brethren, today Church of the Brethren, they called us Dunkards because we baptized by dipping or immersion in a flowing stream. The earliest baptisms were held here. This was the old baptizing place. The creek used to make a bend here. There was a deep pool formed in the roots of these old sycamores, a natural dam, and they took them down there, and the bishop would immerse them 3 times forward in the name of the Father and of the Son and of the Holy Ghost. For some years we baptized further downstream, and then in recent years we had been baptizing here again until the township straightened the creek and ruined our old baptizing place.
Clarence Kulp's folk paintings linger over forgotten persons like Jacob and Polly DeHaven, sextons for the Salford Mennonite congregation. The deacon here wrote that no superfluity would ornament the meeting house of 1850, certainly no Gothic architecture. For that matter, there was none on the first shared building of the Reformed and Lutheran congregations across the township line in Toamenson. The replacement of 1913 was Gothic. The earlier brick building had made such an impression that it inspired a frock tour by a neighboring Schwenkfelder. But what did he mean by the geometric design next door? Another modern marvel, a bridge across the neighboring Skippack at what we call Mainland. What an advance over the hanging footbridge a mile downstream, where the old Maxitoni Trail had crossed. The scenery then seems more inviting than ours, as it does where the trail still crosses the branch in the corner of the township near Vernfield. Our only covered bridge was built 2 miles downstream in 1838, where traffic by John Alderfer's mill was thickening. Near the mill was a blacksmith shop, and a few hundred yards beyond, an inn, later the home of the Raymond Ziegler family on the old Skippack Road. But around the time the bridge made wagon travel easier, the action shifted toward the Lederach homestead at the top of the hill. Here a bigger inn was built, which we know today as the Bay Pony. Responding to the new traffic at this corner, Henry Lederach built a store. This was the beginning of the township's first village, Lederachsville. The next generation remodeled the store building, removing the top story. It still stands today, across the 6-point intersection from the house of the builder, in which Henry and Anna Lederach and their descendants lived for over 160 years, until the fall of 1990. The early growth of Lederachsville produced on one of the other corners a larger competing store, today a tea room and art gallery. Here you could get everything from cigars to sugar to clothing and shoes, without going to Norristown or Philadelphia. The post office and voting booth were here, and here was where the neighborhood news was distributed 6 days a week. For a decade or two, Lederachsville was really the main nucleus of the township, an established stagecoach stop well before the Civil War. Harleysville began a bit later, not so much as a cluster as strung out along the old road from the Wissahickon Mill. The difference was new traffic coming after 1847, when the road was hardened into the Springhouse and Sumneytown Turnpike. This immediately called forth a new store and a new inn, and made new cultural and commercial opportunities possible. Framed by the fields of Pennsylvania German farmers, the new village built up shop by shop and house by house, surpassing neighboring Lederachsville, Franconia Square, and Salfordville because of its heavier traffic. It also attracted a dynasty, actually a school, of medical doctors unparalleled between Allentown and Norristown. Eventually, the rivalry among local villages produced an envious Pennsylvania Dutch rhyme.
Lederach stedel da Saikibel, Salfordville da Degeldribbel, Harleysville du Schenestadt, Ranguni hat da Bettelsock. Lederachville, the swill bucket. Salfordville, the lid over it. Harleysville, thou beautiful city.
How about the one?
Franconia has the beggar's sack.
Clarence Kulp and Bob Bucher's 40-year-long reminiscing over Lower Salford lore takes them back past the Civil War.
Jiggy Binder was that his father had put a black cloth, a banner across the main street when Lincoln was shot.
The military draft, coming 3 times between 1861 and 1865, impacted the township's old families at multiple levels. When one of the Alderfers was drafted, he was enrolled by a cousin, Isaac Alderfer. Another cousin, Benjamin Z. Alderfer, enlisted in Philadelphia, but when his young wife heard it, she cried so desperately that her financier father-in-law, Michael S. Alderfer, managed to extricate his son by paying for a substitute. Michael actually dealt as a broker in substitutes. In this and other ventures, he became the township's richest citizen. His son Benjamin, saved from war service by a substitute, raised his family in peace. But his substitute, Mr. Olschlager, was angry when Benjamin quipped that if he'd known he wouldn't be shot, he'd have gone himself and saved the substitute money. After the war, Lederachsville's Union Cornet Band played at picnics and elections for 3 decades.
These later German immigrants, they called them Die Neudeutsche, the New Germans.
Political turmoil in Europe after 1848 sent forth a flood of emigres, who in America became anything from tramps to manufacturers.
Where the Benders lived and some of these other later Germans out there east of Harleysville, that little community there they called Neudeutschland, New Germany. And a lot of them apparently had been Bavarians and others and had been German Catholics in the old country. They came to this country, they either became Dunkard or Lutheran. I never heard of of any of them becoming Mennonite or Reformed. They became Dunkards or Lutherans. Most of them were craftsmen, tradesmen, and went into business. Mm-hmm. There were shoemakers and clothing, well, a lot of clothing makers in this area that started the clothing factories were of those later Germans.
Samuel Binder, or Bender as it was pronounced locally, was an 1850s immigrant who prospered in making uniforms in the Civil War. His wealth became legendary in the township. He built a large house-like building along the main road in Harleysville, today the site of the hardware store. A quarter-mile west was another factory, first Egolf's, then Oliver Shoup's. The building still stands as a residence along Main Street. It was on the 2nd floor that Shoup's clothing factory gave employment to the overflow of labor from local farms. Entrepreneur Ali Shoup himself was a man of definite opinions.
And one day somebody asked him about his religious situation, his spiritual. He said, "Ich bezahle my power gut, wenn ich nicht in den Himmel komme, ist es sei schon." I'll translate. I pay my pastor real well at Lutheran Church. And if I don't get to heaven, it's his fault.
Bucher and Kulp remember the nuances of local opinion. The Mennonites and Brethren, gathering in meeting houses, had a special term for denominations who called their buildings churches. Church people.
Karichelite, German Lutheran or German Reformed.
Explain
But the German Lutheran and German Reformed that lived around here among our Dunkards and Mennonites, we got along fine with them because they were refined too. But up there in the hills, those were hill people. They were poorer people, and they, they went to the Wattshaus and they got drunk and got into fights. Our people went to the Wattshaus too, but they didn't get drunk and get into fights.
August Quinkwe was one of the Neudeutscher. His sewing machine and bicycle business was a Harleysville fixture, and he himself a part of the village lore.
When they came over, his wife was quite sickly, and they brought the maid with them, a young unmarried girl named Nettie Slaughter. And a small scandal occurred when Nettie became pregnant. Of course, evident that the father was August Quinkwe, and he was brought before the council,
at Indian Creek to confess his sin. And his explanation was, Ich hab bloß einmal für meine Gesundheit und noch hat es ein kleiner Otto gegeben. I did it once for my health, and then it gave such a little Otto.
Across the road, other New Germans had a combination wagon shop and restaurant. The wagon builder was Sam Binder's son, Jakey, who was once razzed by a local jokester.
Well, he asked, which would you rather be, Jake, a Mennonite or a Dunkard? Why, kennst du von? Jakey said. Kennst du von? That means none of them, neither one of those would I want to be. Jake was a Lutheran.
Among the boys growing up along Main Street was Abram Berge, the only survivor when his 3 older siblings died of diphtheria in 1880. His doctor lived across the road, Reinhard Kerr Keeler, native of Upper Salford Township. In 1852, he had entered into a partnership with Dr. Henry Groff, also of Upper Salford. From their homes on Main Street, they taught over 20 other doctors, including 4 of their own sons. The Groff and Keeler homes were socially a cut above those of their neighbors. At one time, at least 10 student doctors would sit down to lunch daily in the Keeler home. But by 1991, the phrase "Doctor's Row" has been forgotten by all but a few Harleysvillians. Just behind the doctors' houses was the wheat field of Jacob and Eliza Kulp. In 1880, the business of Lower Salford was still farming, and the township's wealth was still outside the villages. Nowhere was that more evident than in the Branch Valley home and barn of Michael Alderfer, president of the Perkiomen National Bank. By now, he had crowned his plain 1827 house with a French roof so impressive that a neighboring boy came across the road to draw it. But that wasn't good enough for Michael's son, Ben, photographed with his wife Sarah while recuperating from a train wreck in 1899. With his inherited wealth, Ben had brought home from a Western Railroad jaunt a new design that he felt would be unique on the profile of Lower Salford. The scene on the next farm was simpler and more old-fashioned. Unlike Michael's, Levi Alderfer's barn had no cupola. But even the plain Mennonites had flower beds next to the well and trellises, and the sketch by Levi's 12-year-old brother Philip was a clear statement of a sense of being at home in 1881. Philip's great-niece, Caroline Alderfer, is a carrier of her family's transgenerational memory.
You know, they'd go around to the neighbors for eggs and things, and he died, and they said Philip carried his boots home.
Though the farm Caroline grew up on is now under development, the music of her grandparents' generation lives on in her Franconia apartment. No township home had more famous visitors than that of a bibliophile living along the Indian Creek, Abram Harley Cassel.
Well, this is Abram Cassel and Elizabeth Rhodes Cassel. She was a Quaker, and his parents really were opposed to this, you know, that he was going to marry a Quaker. But they said that he was a book fool. He didn't need a wife, you know.
The precious, youthful portraits of Abraham and Elizabeth Rhodes Cassel have descended to Alma Nice, wife of their great-grandson.
Then he went to school. His father was opposed. He said that he was too eager to learn. If you had too much knowledge, you were sure to turn out to be a crook.
We're in the valley of the Indian Creek at the homestead of Abram Harley Cassel, the great Dunkard historian and bibliophile.
Clarence Kulp, a grand-nephew of Cassel, has chosen to relive the scenario of the life of the township's most famous pre-industrial resident.
And here he married and established his library, which was at one time the second largest private library in the United States and the foundation for the writing of the history of the Pennsylvania Germans in general and the Dunkards and Mennonites in particular. His library was located in the second floor of this house, and it's said that the stacks ran from the floor to the ceiling and were so close to each other that one could just barely squeeze through between the books and manuscripts.
More important to local history was another Dunker, James Joachim Heckler, a schoolteacher and toll gate keeper near Harleysville. He compiled an invaluable farm-by-farm, deed-by-deed account of all the land in the township. It appeared first in a new newspaper that in 1886 marked a stage in the cultural growth of Harleysville. The publisher, Benjamin Gaiman, started in a farmhouse, but after a decade, the paper was bought by youthful Isaiah Haldeman, a state representative to Harrisburg. The self-advertising editor built a fancy headquarters on Main Street and promoted the idea of Harleysville becoming a full-fledged town.
There was the movement that wanted to bring Harleysville into the 20th century and follow all the progressive movements. The political movement was part of that. Harleysville was progressive. They were only interested in making money down there. What makes money? Bucher's grandfather, Manasseh Clemens, they said one time when he bought a new butter churn for his butter making operation, and they asked him if that wasn't too expensive, and he said, "Nix is zu teuer wenn's Geld macht." Nothing is too expensive if it makes money. For the Harleysville people, they were interested in making money.
Though Manasseh Clemens owned the creamery, in his home on Main Street, the family was forbidden to use butter on their bread.
Well, he was trying to save every cent he could to put it in the business. You know, they told my grandfather that he made $1 million and lost it, and then went out and made another $1 million.
Manasseh Clemens was the link between Lower Salford's century and a half of farming and modern food processing. The mill he built on present-day Maple Avenue still stands today as a landmark and antique shop. 90 years ago, in Octobers, it was the mecca for any local farmers with apple orchards, as it wafted throughout the village center the deep, homey aroma of boiling apple butter. Next to the mill, on a site vacant today, stood the main Clemens venture, the creamery, bought from Lyman Rosenberger. For decades, this was one of the busiest establishments in Harleysville, turning milk into cheese and butter. There was a candy factory there, too. But the young man of destiny for Harleysville was another local boy, Alvin C. Alderfer. Having grown up just south of the village, Alvin had surveyed and taught school before running a clothing factory, and finally taking partnership in the creamery with the older Manasseh Clemens.
They were both respected highly. However, Granddad Clemens was much less outgoing than Granddad Alderfer. He was the outgoing one.
Homer Alderfer Clemens is a grandson of both of Harleysville's best-known pioneering entrepreneurs.
Alvin was the leader. He was the one that people would come and ask questions. And my grandfather Clemens was an altogether different person. He was very quiet, very, very difficult to talk to, but they were just two different personalities.
Oh yes, there was a big struggle between M.C. Clemens and Alvin Alderfer for control of the businesses in Harleysville. And my grandfather beat him out pretty bad on most of that.
Actually, Manasseh and Alvin cooperated rather well in the founding of the Harleysville National Bank in 1909 with directors from surrounding small businesses. The new bank building, across the street from the present bank, today serves as the township's police and administrative offices. The signatures of cashier A.A. Price, a Dunkard minister, and President Alvin Alderfer appeared legally on some of the currency. Two protégés of Alvin Alderfer were Ernest Delp and Arthur Alderfer, Alvin's nephew. Both would have their careers in the organizations Alvin began.
Alvin Alderfer believed in saving. His scratch pads were envelopes that he got through the mail. He didn't have scratch pads, he just used the back of envelopes, you know. And he taught us thrift from the beginning.
An early form of insurance had brought a beneficial society to Harleysville. Its founders took pains to announce that this was not a lodge or a secret society, as that idea was deeply disapproved of by local people. But the coming of the automobile and automobile theft brought forth a new kind of insurance that many wanted.
Because his car was stolen, that motivated the people to get together as an organization to reimburse each other if anybody else had their car stolen. So then it was a theft company, and then they decided to add fire insurance to it, and then later they added casualty insurance to it, and that's how the insurance company got started.
It was at a desk in Alvin and Mary Alderfer's Main Street home that the Harleysville Insurance Company began, as recalled by son-in-law Norman Berge.
I remember I used to visit here a lot before I was married, and
Evenings, Dad would sit there doing papers, insurance papers, sign checks. But when 7 o'clock came along, he dropped everything, and we have to listen to Amos and Andy. And I can still see him sit there on that chair, and his belly would shake when he'd laugh, over some of the shoulder roll, and then he'd go back to his work again, and he could write policies and talk at the same time.
I think he had a lot of foresight that many years ago, back in 1915, and to get these three organizations started, the insurance company and the bank and the savings and loan. He was instrumental in all three, and he realized there was a need for investment services, for the people in the area to deposit money and lend it out and get businesses started.
One-horse village businesses supplied most of the community's needs, from tinware to wagons to sleighs. Chair painter Henry Wismer made carriages in a shop behind his house on present-day Maple Avenue, in competition with Jakey Bender on Main Street. Jakey's brother-in-law, white-bearded Hen Schisler, was the longtime local undertaker until his son-in-law Wilmer Nice took over. At the northwestern end of the village was a bakery and ice cream shop, the latter much loved by children. Spanning the threshold between horse-drawn wagons and trucks, Moyer's Bakery was a sign of the times. Being at home in Lower Salford no longer included the smell of bread baking in the oven. In the heart of the village, the 50-year-old Watts House, or inn, passed from owner to owner. While it served as a social center for men, most local plain people considered it off-limits. But everybody went to the store on the other corner. For a while, John Nice had it, and then it passed to the Booker brothers. Here the farmers would stop to talk after bringing their milk to Clemens's and Alderfer's nearby creamery. The store being next to Manass Clemens's house, he was there on the porch when the photographer came. As the village expanded southeastward, another store appeared on land from the farm of well-to-do Henry Delp. Two of Henry's three sons-in-law, Garrett Nice and then Menno Clemens, ran the store at Main and Broad Streets. It was the forerunner of Henning's Supermarket. 2 miles farther east, Mainland was expanding too, with a row of houses on either side of the turnpike. There was a creamery here, and A.H. Mester's popular store. Across the street at the Mainland Inn, somewhat younger than the one at Harleysville, local men would play a game called Ufti Bluck on the bar. Mennonite preacher Christ Allebach would sometimes look into the windows to check if any of his members were there. There was a horse race track beside the nearby bridge, next to which was a tiny house where for decades travelers stopped to pay their toll for using the Springhouse to Sumneytown Turnpike. Poor Lederach, for all its large intersection, missed out on the business boom. It was Abraham H. Nice who began the township's fourth village as a business venture. The Morewood Road from Abram's clothes factory out to the Sumneytown Pike was undependable in winter. So in 1898, he built a tailor shop at what he first called Westfield and later Vernfield after his son Werner. On the high ground between the Branch and the Indian Creeks, it marks the border between Lower and Upper Salford. The clothing factory occupied only one floor, and on another, Abraham's enterprising son William G. Nice, fresh back from Juniata College, went into a greeting card and calendar business, employing even more women.
You'd have a whole table full of cards, and then you'd take one of each, stack them on piles, like this, and then they're the boxes, but you put them out on the table.
From this modest beginning, Will Nice did for Vernfield what Clemens and Alderfer were doing for Harleysville. There was a special atmosphere at the Nice printing plant, built in 1923. Its employees were a good fraction of the membership of the nearby Indian Creek Brethren congregation. Some spent their entire working lives here. One, in fact, came walking across the Pike's Indian Creek Bridge past the meeting house to the factory daily for over 6 decades. It was neighboring farm girl Annie Benner.
Well, I started when I was almost 17, and then I retired when I was 82. Guppy Chi Nice was the boss then. When they started here, he needed more employees. It was in the fall. And then my dad said I could work over winter. The winter didn't end.
Some of the cards Annie wrapped had quite local subjects.
Oh, an awful lot of postcards. And they sent it to the 48 states. I guess it's 50 now.
And some of today's novelties, well...
Turtles. Isn't it Simpson? I don't know what all is on.
The little cares that fretted me, I lost them yesterday among the fields above the sea, among the winds that play, among the lowing of the herds, the rustling of the trees, among the singing of the birds, the humming of the bees.
Annie Benner's young neighbor, Henry Gottschall, composed a song while wandering through a field beside the Indian Creek. When Henry Gottschall sang in his fine tenor voice, it was something you could think on. Commencement, even at a grade school graduation, was a major affair in Lower Salford, giving its participants special status. Arranged in front of photographer Alan Metzger's house, future principal Helen Keeler sat beside auctioneer Carol Hendricks. Most of the township's pupils put in no more than 8 grades at one of the 10 one-room schoolhouses. Not until 1912 had there been any kind of consolidation. But already by 1900, an august new social institution had made its appearance a half-block back from Main Street, Alumni Hall.
You were entitled to join this association providing you were a graduate of Lower Salford Township School. You'd have several musical programs, a lecture perhaps, or a play, and then as time went on, our own people here started to produce plays. I remember on one occasion we had a court trial, and I was to interpret the Pennsylvania Dutch lingo to either the attorney or to the judge, I just forget to who. At least it came to the point where this dog had bit somebody and bit him in the buttocks, and I didn't know just exactly how to describe it, so I said, Hinadale, I hope it's Hinadale gebisse. And I got a good laugh out of the crowd anyway.
We had the only alumni association of a public school who built that fabulous building in Harleysville called the Alumni Hall. And the idea of that was to produce the flowering of the mind. So it wasn't all money. It was also the flowering of the mind.
The flowering of the mind. That was some flower.
There was jealousy among Lower Salford's villages as their citizens prodded each other on who was first to get one of the currently popular chapels. The one in Harleysville, fostered by Dr. Henry Grove, appeared on Creamery, later called Maple Avenue, in 1887. Next to the mill, it had a weekly Sunday school and offered a new option, social religion without membership. Lederach had actually had their chapel a bit earlier.
Boy, we used to go out here to the chapel. We wouldn't miss a Sunday school, you know, and they had me in for a teacher then, and we always had a strawberry festival and cake sales and picnic every year, you know, and preachers coming to the chapel to preach. That was something that we were always looking forward for. And we had a big Sunday school too. Oh, the Hardrunners and the Lederachs and the Mayberries and Henry Alderfers and Harvey Anderson, Clyde Alderfers, and all those people we knew around here. There wasn't anybody in Lederach that we didn't know, and a lot in Skippack and Harleysville and Salfordville and Schwenkfelder, you know. And now you hardly know your next door neighbors nowadays. We really had a good Sunday school. That was a great time. We didn't think of going out and take a trip like they do now.
Alice Slemmer's son Bernard still farms the old place in Lederach as suburbia closes in around them. Lederach did have a trolley stop, as remembered by Alice's neighbor Paul Lederach Sr., whose family has lived here since 1718.
They cross the street, you know, right here. They come up the east side of the Skippack Pike and then crossed over and went over to the front of the store.
The trolley ran between Norristown and Harleysville from 1912 to 1924. It actually caused Creamery, later called Maple Avenue, to be extended eastward toward Souderton. Its last lap led it by the Harleysville toll house. Sometimes the wogglebuck, as it was called in Dutch, had to be dug out of the snow by shovel. And sometimes it was nicknamed the Toonerville Trolley, after a popular newspaper cartoon.
In the mornings, the cars were near full here, just from Harleysville here when they got into it. A lot of people going into Norristown at that time. Factory work, all types of factory work. Of course, that was coming toward World War I, you know, and a lot of war materials being made.
One Lower Salford man wearing a new uniform was a future conductor on the trolley, John Musselman. 4 local draftees posed for the camera in Lansdale, just before boarding the train for Camp Meade, Maryland. Warren Ziegler of the Medical Corps had his picture taken at a cafe on the French Riviera. Back home, Warren's sister Luella wanted her picture taken while wearing his uniform.
I have a picture too of Harvey Keeler and Harry Heckler and myself right before he went to war in 1918.
Stanley Royer has a little boy's memory of the World War.
I'm standing here with my fist closed. I'm only about 4 years old, I believe. They each gave me a penny to pose.
Draftee Harry Heckler died of the flu on his first wedding anniversary. Opportunities for socializing now grew more varied than farm life had allowed. Schoolteacher Joe Price took his girlfriend and her sisters for a ride on the Perkiomen. A picnic in the nearby woods drew a collection of fellows likely to be seen evenings at John Ritter's on Main Street, Harleysville.
We all hung around Ritter's restaurant, and we played a lot of cards, and there's where we would get together and pair off to go out and see the girls, naturally, on a Saturday night. And I think the generations before me did the same thing.
Ritter's helped to make Harleysville what was known as a Coca-Cola capital.
Wiener was a truck driver, and the Coca-Cola company wanted to promote him and take him off that job, and he threatened to quit if they'd take Harleysville away from him, because he'd unload the whole truckload right in Harleysville. And I'll never forget John Koch, who drank a lot of Coca-Cola, and he could take a Coke, and he never moved the chew of tobacco in his mouth, and he'd swallow that whole bottle of Coke with one swallow. And they always asked him, "Well, John, now why do you drink so fast?" He always said, "I was thirsty."
Dunker John Koch was one of the long-term employees of the Clemens Creamery, well after Alvin Alderfer had moved into insurance and Manass Clemens' son Harry had taken it over. Harry also founded a hatchery in the center of town, and in the 1930s made Harleysville into a poultry center for the entire region.
The big barn behind the bank, it was a cattle barn.
Harry's son Homer saw the business grow to an unexpected volume.
Dad bought the building from the bank. The bank owned it, I believe, and that's the building right there.
Harry Clemens' straw hat became something of a logo for Harleysville.
And one thing just led to the next. More and more farmers started to bring. More and more buyers were attracted because of the volume we had. Things kept growing. We went bigger and bigger and bigger until we were the largest in the United States. In this area, we had so many hucksters. We had about 80, 85 hucksters. And the balance would have come from Newark, from New York State, from Allentown, from Norristown, from Philadelphia. Every Wednesday, we would see them. That kept the town pretty busy for one day. People used to say to me, "How can you stand that smell all day long?" I said, "Look, if you don't have that smell all day long, you aren't in business."
Harleysville, poultry, Coca-Cola, bologna, insurance, and baseball. In their supreme moment of glory, the Harleysville Tigers played an exhibition game against the Philadelphia Athletics.
It was quite a time for Harleysville. And then we were in the East Penn League, you know, and we had quite a few ex-major leaguers. The only reason, let's face it, the only reason they made the big leagues to begin with was it was wartime, and they were substitutes.
What was I doing when the war broke? Deer hunting. Coming home from deer hunting, my mother, when we pulled in the lane, my mother came out and said, we're at war.
Another grandson of Alvin Alderfer, Wesley Moyer, went from his father's electrical store in Harleysville to a gunnery crew on a B-29 Super Fortress.
We wound up in India. That was our home base. We would fly our supplies over the hump to China. One day we would take gas, and the next time we would take bombs. But we were shot down on the first mission. Flak hit us hard, and I remember when we got the orders to bail out, at that time, Japanese was flying wingtip to wingtip with us, and he looked over it. I remember, I can see it yet. He had a nice white scarf on, but a big smile on his face. They wanted us, because we were the first B-29 to be shot down anywhere.
After their plane was hit, Wesley jumped for the first time in his life with the entire crew.
I looked up at my chute, nothing there. And that was when I said the shortest prayer in my life, please, Lord. And I ripped it out, and then I felt the chute opening. And then when I hit the ground, or when the chute opened, I said, second shortest prayer, thank you, Lord.
After the crew was captured by unknown forces, their interpreter was a local Chinese woman.
And she explained what was going on, that we fell into the hands of bandits, and that we were now in safe hands, in the hands of the underground. And that's when first time I saw this, I called him Pop, this older man. But all the time she explained it, he was looking at me and grinning. He never saw a redhead before. And from then on, I was his buddy.
While his hometown knew only that he was missing in action, Wesley's crew were working their way secretly across the Chinese countryside.
We only traveled at night. The daytime we slept. And they gave each one of us a hat to wear. When you put this on, in the silhouette, you look like a Chinese at nighttime.
Nearly half a century later, when waking up in the morning, Wesley still looks over to see the hat hanging by his bed.
It's just there as a reminder, you know, that I'm lucky to be here.
After the war, with most of the soldiers and sailors absorbed back into the familiar life of the township, Lower Salford families got their first movie cameras. Naomi Landis got some straw baling near the branch. Raymond Musselman registered the plain clothes of the 1950s as old-timers gathered at Klein's Meeting House near present-day Peter Becker Community. Raymond also got an Easter egg hunt at Vernfield. Wesley Moyer called his little movie Our Hometown, as he preserved sites that would be only memories in 1991.
You're within 20 minutes of Valley Forge, King of Prussia, Fort Washington, 55 minutes of Center City, Philadelphia. And the pressure to live in the country and work in the city or in the more urban centers is what pushes people out here.
We lived in a row house, and thinking about this kind of elbow room is wonderful.
Yeah.
And the view. I think the view, more than anything, is what attracts me, and the trees.
Yeah.
There is no such a thing as a rural area anymore, and it's all part of the city as far as I'm concerned. The city has come out to see us. We can't expect to be living here in the same way as we lived here 50 years ago. I think we have to go with the times. We can't stand back and say that we won't go along because we're forced to go along. And I think it's healthy if we do go along.
An auction used to be the way to redistribute a family's possessions in the community.
155 over here. 155.
Today's farm auction expresses a new relation to the land itself.
155. And just my last call. Is there anyone out there that I can
In 1990, the last mom-and-pop store in the region closed in Vernfield.
So how many years have you been here, Paul?
I'll be 37 in October.
37?
Not 37 in October or August. 37. That's low enough, I think. Thank you.
Thank you. Have a good weekend.
As one Lower Salford institution fades out, another points toward the future.
I'm Walter Dowler, and I'd like to welcome you all and thank you for coming to help us celebrate the opening of our new main office addition. We like to retain as much of the old as we possibly can because we think it's good. But we also see ourselves as needing to be a little more progressive and to change with the times.
Alvin Alderfer and Manasseh Clemens's bank has done something right, according to Forbes magazine, which has described the bank as perhaps the brightest gem among the 10,000 community banks in the United States. A strong communal sense of feeling at home does translate into stable institutions. Although Alvin Alderfer would have been amazed by the growth of the company he began, especially by the new building erected a decade after his death, his portrait and his legacy still guide the company.
It is this type of community, the people that populate this community, that give the company its core value, its value of service to the customer. And so while the company has grown, certainly has grown, the purpose for which it was organized by Mr. Alderfer remain the same today as they did in the beginning.
Amidst the new suburbia, some century-old ways of being at home haven't entirely disappeared.
We are the small family farm here. We only have the small herd of about 20 cows, a few chickens, around 300 for our own use and for the neighbors who come and want to have fresh eggs. We should go larger to go into a larger volume, but that is impossible here, so it's really getting to be a burden to stay here and farm in this area. If I was a young fella, I wouldn't stay here. It's just no opportunity to make a decent living. And being it was the family homestead here, it was passed on, and that is why we don't have the big overhead.
That's why we're here.
That's right.
A real community keeps some memory of the way things used to be. Sally and Lizietta sitting on the porch at the old homestead. Fanny sewing a pattern taught by a great-grandmother. Or students regathering at the office of Drew Lewis, once the Gargus schoolhouse of their youth.
History or any lore that you think is interesting. For example, Vince Nice gave me one. I'm going to mail these out. So you have a number of...
People enjoy being in a place like this, rich in heritage, but young at heart. Age and youth gliding forward together on the ancient stream of time, happy to be at home in Lower Salford.